Welcome to episode 67 of Decision Point, looking at part 3 of the series, Is Christianity True? So we've been going over these 3 facets of Christianity, comparing them to other world religions, saying that these 3 tenets have to be true to talk about the validity of Christianity. Now we're using biblical sources as well as extracurricular sources, extra biblical sources, if you will, to demonstrate these 3 facts. First, that Jesus existed. That was 2 weeks ago. Last week we covered the idea that Jesus had to be crucified. Those are validated historically from the Bible and outside of the Bible. Now today's a little bit more interesting in the fact that Jesus had to be resurrected. Now, if Christianity is true, resurrection is a huge part. Now, there is so much you can go over. There are so many books, and I'd recommend so many by Dr. Gary Habermas. There's some great on defense of the resurrection. You have some great stuff also by, Dr. William Lane Craig, Hunter Braxton. There's a lot of authors I've read over the years, especially recently, that have some great information on if you want to dig down really, really deep. So today is a very, very superficial look at the resurrection of Jesus Christ and its validity. Now, as we get into this, look at this as you would a crime drama, all right? When you have a murder suspect or a violent crime, I don't know what the percentage is, but I know it's very, very high that these incidents were not caught on tape. They had eyewitnesses, in some cases no eyewitnesses, but to convict a murderer or any other violent crime offender, what you have to have is probable cause. So what we're going to have for the resurrection is probable cause. So when you put someone away in jail or give them some kind of punishment criminally, it's not that they're 100% guilty per se, if you will. And if those of you who are lawyers and policemen and that sort of thing understand this more than I do, but it is just beyond, there's no doubt that can be thrown against the evidence that makes it clear this didn't happen. There's no good logical reasoning that would say, no, this person is innocent. And it is harder to convict than it is to cast a shadow of a doubt. But the case we have for the resurrected Jesus Christ is so imbalanced, if you will, in favor of the resurrection that it is very, very difficult to deny the fact that something like this happened. So briefly, again, looking at our world religions comparison chart, for the resurrection, you can see all the no's going down that row of beliefs in world religions that do not believe Jesus Christ rose again. Jehovah's Witnesses believe he rose again as a spirit creature, but not resurrected, as we talk about bodily resurrection. And then even in Hinduism, Jesus did die, but he became an enlightened person and merged with God spiritually. And then Roman Catholics believe the same thing that biblical Christians believe, that he did resurrect. So this is a real case of deviation in world religions. Everyone believe he lived. Most everyone, with the small exception of 1 or 2, believe he was crucified. But the resurrection is a great divergent point between the world religions. So is there biblical evidence and extra biblical evidence that backs up the fact that Jesus Christ rose from the dead? Now, I mentioned Dr. Gary Habermas. He's a professor over at Liberty University, where I had my undergrad. And also, he is a prolific author and speaker. He came up with the 12 minimal facts. And here they are. I know it says 12, but 11 and 12 here really go together as number 11. So he proved the resurrection in a scale system based upon these facts. Number 1, we know for sure Jesus died by crucifixion. We know for sure he was buried in a tomb. And then we know for sure, according to historians and biblical evidence, that the disciples upon his death were despaired. They felt hopeless. Even historians wrote about how for a moment Christianity kind of died down as followers kind of abandoned him. Then they came back stronger than ever. 4 is also historically easily to figure out. The tomb is empty a few days later from the pro-Christian group and non-Christian groups. His body is not found. 5, we read about last week and the week before from historians how that they believed, the disciples, that they saw his risen body. They believed that they saw and spoke with him. Number 6, again, historians also talked about this, that the disciples were transformed. They were not scared anymore. They became leaders. They were emboldened, if you will. 7, we're going to talk about more in detail here in a few minutes about his resurrection being the center of the message. So they preached Christ's resurrection as part of the gospel message from the beginning. This was not a later development, as some secular scholars will lead you to believe, but I'll show you where that comes from here in a little bit. That the disciples, number 8, they didn't just go to other places and declare that Jesus Christ resurrected. They did it right there where the Pharisees and the Sadducees actually had him killed. They did it in Jerusalem to the faces of the people who had Jesus Christ crucified. They were that bold. There was a great growth, again, historically chronicled, of the Christian faith, just out of, seems like nowhere, from a few to thousands. And then it began to spread across all of Europe, Asia, and Africa. Just amazing growth. 10, this one is overlooked as a good point. And I mentioned Dr. Habermas because he really dove into detail on this one. But the worship now changes. The Jews who are converted to Christianity openly accept Sunday as the day of worship because that's the day of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So they changed from the Sabbath day, which was ingrained and instilled in them from the time they were young, to the Sunday is the primary day of worship. They began to gather on Sunday. And as a side note, that is the only 10 commandments from the Old Testament not repeated by Jesus, to maintain the Sabbath day as it was. Matter of fact, Jesus just said that the Sabbath day, man was not made for the Sabbath, but Sabbath made for man. And there's a whole other teaching involved in that as well. But they abandoned their day of worship to God from Friday night to Saturday night and transformed it to Sunday. So that's a whole large demonstration of facts and proofs that something happened. And then 11 and 12 go in together, the skeptics. You had James, the half-brother of Jesus, later on completely converting and realizing that Jesus Christ was the Messiah. You have Saul, who converted to Paul, and you have many others as well. Believe it's Acts that mentions that many of the Pharisees, they came to believe Jesus Christ was the Messiah after his resurrection. So you have the skeptics who are staunchly opposed to Jesus in his life ministry, turning to him. So these are some great facts that kind of build a case, if you will, for the resurrection. So let's look at what else builds it. And I know it's kind of hard to memorize 11, so luckily here we break it down into what we call the case for Christ. And I'll put this all on the screen at once, but spell out the word case, alliteration here for you. Crucifixion, he was definitely crucified. He appeared, skeptics converted, and early Christians began to immediately talk about the resurrection, not just his life and death. So if you need more time, you can always go back and look at this. We're going to go on to the demonstration of probably one of the most, of these at least, these four, the one that needs the most reference and the most demonstration. Well, people attested to what happened. Not just in the Bible we talked about, but Josephus, Tacitus, Lucian, we mentioned those all last week and the week previous. You can go back and look at their quotes. That Jesus was crucified and he rose. That at least that they were mentioned that he rose. That the disciples claimed that he rose and they saw him. Now, the early attestation was in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7. Now, knowing the timeline of the writings of the Gospels, of the epistles in the New Testament, a lot of non-Christian, especially secular historians and scholars for this time of of history rather, would go out and they're saying that basically Jesus' resurrection is a myth and it built upon time. That it really didn't become part of the teaching until 40, 50, 60 years, even later than that on. That it was a building process to get to that idea that he resurrected, or the idea that Jesus was God. Well, that is thrown away by 1 Corinthians alone, because 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7 speaks specifically of his death, resurrection, and his appearances. And this is coming from an oral tradition that was eventually written down, and then 1 Corinthians alludes to it, and it is dated to within, at the latest, 3 years after his death. So somewhere between 6 months and 3 years after Christ's crucifixion, they were already spreading and sharing and teaching that he rose from the grave. So this is not a development that occurred. This was an immediate, from the beginning, part of the gospel. Again, that's oral traditions written down right after this happened. And they say, well, why did it take so long for Paul to write this in a letter? Well, first and foremost, you have to say that we don't know if this is the first time it was ever written down. We just know this is the first official record that was kept and that survived. And second, you can't disprove that it wasn't written somewhere else, or that this oral translation, this oral tradition wasn't passed on. You're taking a big leap by saying that, well, 1 Corinthians is written here, so you're talking a decade, 2 decades after this happened, that this is what's going on. Well, no, the oral tradition of the time, they didn't write things down like we do, or like historians did. They taught verbally, singing songs, sharing information from town to town, and it spread very quickly across the world. So we have good reason and back up historically to believe that this was always part of the gospel from the beginning. And then the final attestation is simple. The Bible records it, but historically as well, nobody has ever given a good reason, a good excuse, a plausible answer to the fact of where the body of Jesus is. Now, to build a straw man against Christianity, a false setup, we can also go to an extreme and say that, well, Jesus had to resurrect because they didn't find his body. That's the only logical explanation. That is not the only logical explanation. That is the most probable given the evidence according to the Christian faith. But we have to understand that when we're witnessing, when we're talking to people who don't believe the Bible, we have to be very careful with saying that's the only possible answer, because we're going to see in a little bit that they do have some examples. They do have some ideas that we can knock down also, but we'll talk about those quickly in a little bit. Last two things before we get to those is this. There is some embarrassment level of the disciples claiming the tomb was empty. So if you know historically that women's testimony was not accepted in the Middle East. They were not allowed to go to court. They were not part of your witness. It would be embarrassing to have a woman give a testimony for a certain case. Well, who finds the empty tomb? Most of you are familiar with this. Mary Magdalene, Mary, mother of Jesus, Salome, others mention other women there without a name. But they tell the disciples. So the disciples would have a large amount of embarrassment to pass this information on if a woman told them. And as a matter of fact, when they went around and said that, they often repeated that he appeared first to the women, that the women first saw the tomb. They didn't take the credit for themselves. So in that day and age, this would have been embarrassing for women to have been the first and primary source of witnesses. Second, the dissimilarities. There's what was expected to happen. According to Jewish custom, reading the Talmud and other writings from Pharisees and scribes at the time, the Jewish people expected a resurrection. But to briefly go through this, they expected a spiritual resurrection. Now, we can look back now to the Old Testament and see clearly where, obviously it was talking about a physical resurrection, but that's not what was taught by Jewish scholars. They believed in a spiritual resurrection. So when the disciples claimed that Jesus Christ rose bodily, that didn't jive well with what the Pharisees and the people of the time believed. That would have been unheard of. That was not thought to have happened. So that wasn't the regular. So the disciples weren't claiming something that the Jewish people were expecting. So even by claiming the women found the tomb empty first and that Jesus appeared to them first, that's an embarrassment issue that would derail their claims. And so is the bodily resurrection. The people they're talking to don't believe in the bodily resurrection. So the disciples aren't playing a game here for power, for wealth, for prestige, to keep these things going. They know that what they're witnessing to and testifying to actually can be an embarrassment and discredit them if it were not true. So let's be fair and honest, and let's look at some of the alternate theories to the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So with the 11 minimal facts there, the case for Christ, all these things from the Bible and exterior sources, historically speaking, there's a pretty good case, so much so that many scholars, secular scholars over the years, atheological scholars, meaning those who don't believe in God, who are studying the Bible and its historicity, throw up these alternative theories to dissuade believers. So there's enough evidence where they have to take their time and say, well, this is what could have happened. And first of all, you have the swoon theory. The swoon theory basically is Jesus Christ passed out from blood loss, from the pain on the cross, but never really died. There are some big problems with this. Number one and foremost, the Romans were really good at their job. If they wanted to kill you, they're going to kill you. They didn't just toss people into the Colosseum and hope they died. They made sure there were hungry lions, tigers, and whatnot, bloodthirsty gladiators, fight to the death. When they crucified, they did it to end your life. There is no attestation, no proof, no claim that anyone ever survived crucifixion and was released from that penalty. Matter of fact, the Bible even says those who did not die fast enough, speaking of the thieves on the cross, they broke their legs so they would suffocate faster. They pierced Christ's side to make sure he was dead. So above the torture that they went through, they made sure that the people on the cross were dead or wherever they crucified them. Then second problem, if Jesus is battered and beaten to the degree the Bible explains, and he did pass out on the cross, and for some reason the Roman soldiers neglected to make sure he was dead, how could Jesus in his state remove the wrapping, the mummification type wrapping that would have been on his body, and remove that stone to walk out on his own power? That's very implausible. And thirdly, he did appear to people, as the claim goes, but he would have not looked like himself. The Bible mentions he was unrecognizable, flesh torn from his body. The way you can explain that or look at that is his insides were on full display. He was a shell of a human, if you would, to put it mildly. When he appeared to people, he would not look like someone that would be they to talk to and just hang out with. He would look like someone in need of ICU medical treatment at that moment immediately. Hallucination theory, the mass hallucination effect. Now, people cite things like when people see UFOs in the sky, or the crash at Roswell, for example, for you alien conspiracy people who understand all that if someone sees something quickly, they can kind of talk themselves into believing it, or they can hallucinate seeing something extra and above what was really there. Mass hallucination effect. There have been cases of this in other places. I won't go through them for time's sake. But first and foremost, never to the degree of what the Bible claims of him appearing to 500 people at one time. 500 people, if they witness an event, they'll attest, they'll talk about things with different details. There's no indication that people who saw Jesus Christ had different details about what he looked like, where he was, all these things. There was just actually more that they just saw who he was. He said what he said, and that was him. Okay, the 500 people for hallucination effect is way too far and above what is really been proved by science. Actually, only a few people at a time can really have a hallucination effect at the same time without the effects of drugs and so on and so forth. Well, skeptics turn to him, not just followers. We talked about James and Paul turning to him, but I mentioned it earlier about the Pharisees who came to follow him also. because of the testimony of the witnesses. Some may have seen him also in this large group, but as well, all this other proofs demonstrated that other Pharisee leaders and people turned to Christ after that when they saw the evidence, if you will, or heard the evidence. And then with hallucination effect, they're not contagious. I kind of mentioned that with the 500, but it's not like I get a hallucination and the next person to me, because I cough on them, they have the same hallucination. It's an event that doesn't pass on. It's an individual, or at minimum, a small group of people. And then the final couple here quickly. The disciples invented it. It's just something they began, and they wanted to finish it. They wanted to continue on for popularity, power, wealth, or they were just stubborn. Okay? There's some legitimacy to this one above the other so far. This probably, in my opinion, is the best example of an alternate theory to his resurrection. However, we know that the majority of the disciples died for Jesus. We have other martyrs in the Bible mentioned, Stephen for one, Paul for one, willing to die for their belief. Liars make poor martyrs. Why would someone die for a lie? Now, we can say that people do die for what is not true. What about all the terrorists who will come in the name of Islam or their own religion, whatever it is, and kill themselves? They believe what they believe, and they'll die for it. Well, they've been indoctrinated with that belief. There's a difference in knowing something's a lie and dying for it versus being indoctrinated with something and willing to die for it. The disciples are martyrs not because they wanted to be or they were indoctrinated with this idea. The claim is the disciples are lying about this. They're making it up. They're not going to kill themselves or have themselves killed, have themselves go through these bad events that bring nothing but pain and suffering when they're making these claims and wanting to die for that claim. When you make something up, it would take a lot for someone to make something up and be willing to die for that. Although it can happen, there is some proof to that. But good Jews, like these men, don't lie. You're talking about disciples who followed the law, who followed everything in the Mosaic laws to the best of their ability, were raised to be good, upstanding citizens within their structure of their society. And what the discipleship invention theory says is they've changed their character. They've gone from people who want to do good to people who are now completely malicious and evil. That doesn't go well with their characters. So you're literally saying these people have completely shifted gears from wanting truth, wanting what's right, to wanting to maliciously lead people to a lie. It doesn't work in how the idea of how people are. This would be a very strange conspiracy theory for not just these 12, but everyone else who ever walked with Jesus, everyone else who ever saw Jesus, to fall into line with this deception and become people who are sharing lies purposely. And then the last two, replacement theory, literally someone took his place on the cross. We have the Muslims who say Judas took his place on the cross and Jesus just appeared later on, so he never really died on the cross. Again, fairly easily debunked by history itself. And then the last one, which I love, is just called the something happened theory. We can't figure it out. These other theories don't work out for us, so there must be a logical explanation somewhere. They don't want to believe historical facts. They don't want to believe what the Bible says. They don't fall into these alternate theories and believe any of these, but there's got to be an answer somewhere along the way. Some of the things that follow under the something happened theory is that the gardener at the garden tomb buried Jesus' body in the sand by the river. Why? There's no reason. If he was in a tomb, did he hide it because he wanted to save Jesus' body from what the Romans might do to it? I don't know. But again, there's nothing to back it up historically. They're just theories thrown out there because something did happen. We can't explain it, but there has to be a reason for it. So as you weigh all of the evidence, all of the theories against resurrection, again, this was a flyby.